We are 2,500 years after this, and the world hasn't changed. Just to set the backdrop of what's going on, Daniel is a member of the nobility in Israel. He is a young man at this time in the first chapter, because that's what we're covering tonight. And in the kingdom of Israel, or I should say in the kingdom of Judah, because this is around 605 BC, during the first invasion into Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So Babylon is coming as predicted by the other prophets, as predicted by Isaiah, as predicted by Jeremiah, and even as predicted, by Ezekiel, but this is before Ezekiel's writing. Babylon is coming. The people of Judah have been warned and warned and warned again that their vain traditions in worship and vain sacrifices, when their heart is not really given over to God, that if they don't repent and start worshiping God, that this judgment will come and God will use it as a refining fire to purify and bring forth the faithful remnant whom he has promised to bring back to Jerusalem after this judgment. Well, this is the beginning of that judgment. Nebuchadnezzar has taken over as king of Babylon. He's the big bad man on the scene in the world, and he is coming after everyone. He is attacking Tyre, he is attacking Jerusalem, and this is the first siege in 605 BC. Now, the siege on Jerusalem, there's 3 of them, and this war lasts for a long time. It's not until 586 BC, about 20 years later, that this concludes with the burning down of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. But this is the early stages of it, with the king coming against the city walls. So let's open up and see what God has for us in store in the book of Daniel. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So this is what's going on. There's been a transition of power within the kingdom of Judah. That has signaled the enemies of Judah as a time when it's a little bit easier to attack, because in a transition of power, it's hard to centralize forces. Nebuchadnezzar is coming up against the wall, and he actually invades and gets some victory, and he's taking with him some of the vessels or the temple instruments used for worship. This is actually sort of a unique thing of Nebuchadnezzar, where he would take aspects of other deities' worship from other nations and bring them into his nation as a way to proclaim the power of his gods over the power of the gods of the foreign nations. Because in the early pagan world, in the Middle East, they really believed that the gods were over regions. And if your god was more powerful, you could usurp the land of another god, as long as your God was more powerful. It's about having the most powerful God. Where in Judaism, and ultimately in Christianity, we realize that there is one true God over all of creation. And there was a difference of understanding, but this is something Nebuchadnezzar did to try to proclaim the greatness of his gods over Yahweh. So then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Now, not only is he taking away temple pieces of furniture or vessels for worship of Yahweh from the temple, now he's telling, one of his chief generals to take with him nobility, take with him people from Jerusalem who are of royal lineage, which includes Daniel. And he has a plan. Now, one of these things is when he sieges, which is what you'll ultimately see, when he sieges Jerusalem, and all of Jerusalem and all of Judah is brought in captive to Babylon, his goal is to have these young wise men already be assimilated into Babylon, so that the royalty and nobility in Jerusalem is already assimilated. So when the rest of the Jews come into Babylon, the people they would look towards for leadership will already be deep within the Babylonian culture. So he's trying to assimilate the rest of the population by grabbing some of the royal leadership first. And what does he do with them? He takes them into the king's palace and teaches them the language and the culture, the literature and the language of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. So what he's doing is he's ripping the young men of nobility, which, by the way, is no different than what culture does today. Advertising, marketing, everything is aimed at a generation who will have likely the most influence over the next generation. There's a reason that there's a key demographic in all of media, because once you pass a certain age, they don't see you as influential over the next generation anymore, just because of the way culture works. This is what he's doing. He's grabbing a key demographic and he's removing them from their homes, from their culture, from their traditions, and from their way of worship, and bringing them into the palace and saying, look at how great this is, into the hanging gardens of Babylon, one of the wonders of the world. And then removing them from what they know and then filling them with Babylonian culture. We are 2,500 years after this, and the world hasn't changed. What the world wants to do to us is isolate us from what is good and fill us with the world so that we can assimilate to the ways of the world, because the hearts of men love darkness. That's the idea. And basically, Nebuchadnezzar is utilizing human nature against the nobility in Jerusalem as a tool to be influential over the rest of the Jews when they are forced into Babylon. So the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate, of the wine that he drank, and they were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time were to stand before the king. So while they're in the palace, at the hanging gardens of Babylon, receiving the literature and culture from Babylon, the king is also saying, look at what you get to have. He's giving them the choice cuts of meat from his table and filling them with all of the richness of being royalty in Babylon, the city of gold. So he's filling them with all of the pleasures of the world and removing them from the worship of the one true God. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. Now this is the last bit of tactic. So you see, the first thing they do is isolate them from their families, remove them from their structure and culture and tradition. The next thing they do is indoctrinate them with only the literature and culture from Babylon. Then they get them to concede. They give them concessions, food and drink from the royal palace of Babylon. And now the last piece is to confuse them, to remove them from their identity and give them a new identity. See, Daniel and his friends and all of Second Temple and First Temple Judaism, and all the way back to the patriarchs, including Abraham, people throughout the Old Testament would name their children for a reason. Their names had a purpose. It was usually either a reference to circumstances around their birth, For instance, Esau was named Esau because he's red and hairy. So instances around his birth, or they would give them a name for the hope they would have for that child's future. So in Daniel's case, Daniel's name means God is my judge, that Yahweh is his judge. And there's a hope for his future to be submissive to the one true God. That's the hope for Daniel in his future. Hananiah means beloved of the Lord. Mishael means who is like Yahweh, who is like God. And Azariah means the Lord is my help. So the parents of these boys named them names with great submissive and worshipful attitudes towards the one true God. Now look at what they're renamed in Babylon. Daniel is called Belteshazzar. So he goes from being God is my judge to may Baal protect the king. May Baal protect the king. A false god, a false worship is given to the name of Daniel, whose name once held the name of the one true God. To Hananiah, his name goes to Shadrach, which means illuminated by the sun god Rach. Meshach, because he went from Hananiah to Shadrach, illuminated by the sun god Rach. Mishael, whose name means who is like God, is given the name Meshach, whose name is now who is like Aku, the sun goddess in Babylon. So from someone whose identity was supposed to proclaim the greatness of the God of Israel, of the one true God, Yahweh, he's now given a name to proclaim the greatness of a false god in Babylon. And Abednego, or Azariah, whose name meant the Lord is my help, Abednego is now given the name of servant of the shining one, Nego. So they're consistently being removed from their culture, given new culture, been given the pleasures of this world, and now are consistently called a new name and given a new identity that are directly connected to false gods in Babylon. This is Nebuchadnezzar's sort of school of tyranny and assimilation so that he can rule over people and assimilate them into his culture. And he's hoping when the rest of the Jews come, if he's assimilated the royal leadership and these young men who will be influential, they'll have influence over everyone else to assimilate into their culture. However, the problem is he picked Daniel and his friends who were able to withstand the onslaught of culture and the onslaught of the world. See, the first chapter of Daniel, so as we go through this series in the book of Daniel, tonight we're going to focus on chapter 1. Next week we'll focus on chapter 2. Because the first chapter really sets up the character of who Daniel the prophet is. And as you go through the book of Daniel, you'll see that it's sort of a twofold story. About half the time, you're getting insight into Daniel's very life and the way that he lived his life and the faith that he had towards God. And then the other half of the time, you're getting prophetic vision into the future that you know comes from a holy source because of the attitude and the type of worship and faithfulness that Daniel had towards God. And the first chapter sets up Daniel's character, and the second chapter sets up the template for all of the prophecy that's going to be given through the rest of the book as well. So tonight we're focusing on the first chapter, and we're going to get into Daniel's character. From this point, or up to this point, we've been dealing with the way that Babylon has forced itself onto the captives. Now we're going to see the response of Daniel and his friends. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink, for why should he see that you are worse conditioned than the youths who are your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. So this is what's going on. Because this person, the chief of the eunuchs, is in charge of this group of guys, Daniel and his friends, that they have gained favor with him. They spent time with him. He's seen the character of these boys. And ultimately, he's empathetic towards them. But their request is to not eat from the king's table, to not eat anything that's been sacrificed to an idol or to a false god, to not consume anything impure, because they only want to consume what is pure. They want to stay pure before God, even as they're away from temple worship. Now, the eunuch has empathy towards them, and he likes these guys, and he sees them as useful for his job, but he also understands if he disobeys the king, and these 4 boys look weak because they're not eating meat and protein, that his life will be at stake because he's done a bad job at taking in the boys he's trying to assimilate into Babylonian culture. And Nebuchadnezzar, if you don't know about him, Nebuchadnezzar is the ultimate tyrant in human history. He was not subject to any laws of the country. He was the law. If he said something, it was done. Whatever Nebuchadnezzar wanted is what happened. There was nothing that withheld him from it. He was ultimate power within Babylon. And so this guy is clearly afraid of, if I make the king angry, he'll kill me. Because he was also known for his intense cruelty. So then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better of appearance and fatter in the flesh than all of the youths who ate of the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So Daniel says, okay, test me. Daniel puts his faith to the test and he says to the eunuch, go ahead, I understand your position. Give us 10 days. If we don't look strong at the end of this 10 days by maintaining a pure diet, then treat us accordingly. Whatever you see is right, whether that's changing our diet, punishing us, whatever you see is right, you go ahead and do. But because the eunuch had compassion and empathy for them, he allowed that judgment period of time to go on. And at the end of that 10 days, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were stronger than the other boys who were brought into Babylon. And they were the ones eating the diet that was approved by the Levitical law. So as for these youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all wisdom and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom, and Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus, which you see in Isaiah chapter 45. So Daniel and his friends have all become the cream of the crop. Not only have they been the best of the best in terms of those that have been brought into in captivity through the wars that Nebuchadnezzar is waging, of the own astrologers and wise men within the nation of Babylon, these guys are better. They have more wisdom. They seem to know things that others don't. They have more clarity. They're stronger. And because of that, they gain all kinds of favor. And they last, and Daniel in particular, lasts as a leadership in the kingdom of Babylon, and ultimately, because of his position of power and wisdom in Babylon, he finds favor with the kings of Persia who take over Babylon. The reason that that's important and interesting is because the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians, often called their wise men magi. And the magi, who came from the east, which is where Babylon is in relation to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, who came to visit Jesus when he was born, were likely from Babylon. It's likely that because Daniel became the chief of all the wise men during his time, that there was a group that he had such influence over because of his holiness and righteousness and faithfulness to God, that there was still, all that time later, when Jesus was born, people who were still following and keeping the teachings of Daniel, who were ready for the sign to appear. And Daniel's influence lasted to Jesus, because Daniel did what we ought to do, which is, in the face of the onslaught of culture, in the onslaught of propaganda, and trying to get us away from the truth and fill us up with culture and fill us up with the way of the world's thinking and isolate us from what is good and keep us apart from what is true, Daniel said, no, I will not defile myself with what is unclean, and I will worship the one true God. And that is what we are asked to do. You know, Jesus told us that if the world hated him, it would hate us too. That were to expect difficulty in this world and persecution, and to stand up for what is true. Because what is eternal is more important than what is temporary. And Daniel is a great example of that life. And you're going to get to see through this study how he consistently lives from a teenager to an old man faithfully for God. Let's pray.